In medieval England, the church was not simply a religious institution, it was the axis around which village life revolved. To the average villager, someone who likely never traveled more than a few miles from home, the church was the beginning and the end of understanding. It provided the rhythms of the week, the meaning of the seasons, the structure of life, and the promise of what lay beyond death. It offered reassurance, commanded obedience, dictated behavior, and shaped the moral boundaries of daily experience. In a world without newspapers, schools, or centralized administration, the Church stood as the single unifying authority connecting the most isolated hamlet to the rest of Christendom. In the center of nearly every medieval village stood a church, often the largest building for miles. Its thick stone walls, tall tower, and ringing bell announced its presence long before a person entered the village. For villagers, the church building was more than a place to pray. It was a meeting hall, a courtroom, a community archive, a school, and the site of every major life event. To walk past the church each morning meant passing the symbol of divine authority, a reminder that every moment of life was lived under the eye of God. The priest, though often from humble origins himself, represented this divine authority in a direct and tangible way. He alone could read Latin, he alone could interpret Scripture, he alone could perform the sacraments necessary for salvation. Villagers depended on him not only for spiritual instruction, but also for guidance in matters of morality, disputes among neighbors, the proper way to raise children, which days required fasting, and when work must pause for holy days. His word carried weight not because of personal power, but because the Church claimed that authority flowed from God through the clergy. The tone of a medieval day was set by the Church before any villager lifted a tool or stepped into the fields. Dawn often began with the sound of the church bell ringing across the village. The bell was more than a call to worship. It was a timekeeper in a world largely without clocks. Its sound told villagers when to wake, when to work, when to break, and when to return home. Even those who did not attend morning prayers lived according to the bell's steady instruction. The Church controlled the calendar just as firmly as it controlled the hours of the day. More than one-third of the medieval year consisted of feast days, saints' days, fast days, and holy periods that required villagers to adjust their routine. Some days prohibited work entirely. Others required fasting from dawn until dusk. Some involved elaborate processions through the fields to bless the crops, or special services to drive away evil spirits believed to lurk in the landscape. The agricultural cycle, plowing, sowing, harvesting, was framed by religious seasons such as Lent, Easter, Michaelmas, and Advent. The Church's calendar overlapped the natural world, transforming the year into a sacred timeline. Religious teachings defined not only when villagers worked, but how they understood their work. The priest taught that labor was ordained by God as both duty and virtue. Working the land was considered part of the divine plan for humanity, a reminder of Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise. Suffering was interpreted as a test of faith. Good harvests were blessings, while floods, droughts, or blights were warnings or punishments. When misfortune struck, villagers didn't blame luck, weather patterns, or agricultural technique. They looked to the Church for explanations rooted in sin or divine displeasure. The priest's words shaped how villagers interpreted every event, good or bad. Even the landscape surrounding the village bore religious meaning. Crosses at crossroads marked places of protection. Shrines stood near springs believed to hold healing power. Rood lofts inside churches displayed painted images of Christ's crucifixion, visible to villagers as they walked through the nave. These visual symbols were essential in a world where most people could not read. They taught lessons, reinforced doctrine, and reminded villagers of the consequences of moral failure. Fear played a role, but so did comfort. The presence of saints' images and holy relics reassured villagers that powerful intercessors watched over them. The church also controlled how people marked the major transitions of life. Birth, marriage, illness, and death were not private events. They were woven into the church's ritual structure. A newborn infant had to be baptized as soon as possible to secure its place in heaven. Marriage required the priest's blessing and was treated not merely as a union, but as a sacrament, binding two families under the church's authority. When villagers fell ill, they sought the priest for both prayer and practical guidance, and when death approached, the church presided over the final rites, the burial, and the prayers for the soul's journey. Every stage of life was surrounded by ritual, reinforcing the idea that human existence belonged to God. Even economic life rested partly in the church's hands. Villagers owed a tithe, 1/10 of their produce, to the church. This was not voluntary. It was required by canon law. Grain, vegetables, wool, eggs, honey, and livestock all made their way into the tithe barn each year. The church's economic power meant that it owned large portions of land, mills, and sometimes even fisheries. The priest, though not wealthy by noble standards, represented the institution that held significant financial influence over every villager's livelihood. In disputes between neighbors, the church often acted as mediator. The priest's counsel carried authority because villagers believed that refusing his guidance risked spiritual danger. Gossip, theft, adultery, blasphemy, even small moral lapses were brought before the priest, who judged not only the act, but the state of the soul behind it. Church courts tried offenses ranging from broken marriage vows to accusations of witchcraft. Penalties took the form of public confession, fasting, pilgrimages, or charitable acts rather than imprisonment. The goal was to restore spiritual purity, not enforce secular justice. Fear of the supernatural, too, was shaped by the church. Villagers believed in demons, angels, spirits of the dead, miracles, divine punishments, and the power of prayer to ward off evil. Many of these beliefs were reinforced by sermons delivered each Sunday. The priest spoke of heaven and hell as vividly real destinations. Hell, especially, loomed large in the medieval imagination, a place of fire, torture, and eternal suffering. Villagers believed that even minor sins could accumulate and drag a soul toward damnation. This fear strengthened the church's ability to guide behavior, enforce moral standards, and maintain authority. Through these intertwined mechanisms, ritual, timekeeping, economics, morality, social order, and spiritual fear, the church held a central, unchallenged position in medieval English life. To understand a medieval village, one must understand the church that shaped it. The church's influence in medieval English villages reached far deeper than weekly sermons or holy days. Its power came not only from its rituals, but from its ability to define truth itself. In a world without common literacy, without widespread access to books, and without alternative institutions of learning, the church served as the single gatekeeper of knowledge. What villagers understood about the cosmos, the human body, morality, sin, salvation, and even the seasons was filtered through the lens of Christian doctrine. The church became the interpreter of reality, shaping the mental landscape of every villager from birth to death. This control over knowledge began with one fundamental fact: the villagers could not read. Most could not even write their names. The Bible itself existed only in Latin, a language villagers did not speak, did not read, and rarely even heard outside the church walls. The priest alone could access its content, interpret its passages, and translate its meaning into the local tongue. To the villagers, Scripture existed as a distant and sacred power, profound, mysterious, and entirely dependent on the priest's explanations. This gap between knowledge and comprehension created an enormous imbalance of authority. If the priest said God demanded something, few would question it, not because they lacked intelligence, but because no alternative source of truth existed. Sermons delivered each Sunday were therefore more than spiritual lessons. They were the primary source of education. Through these sermons, villagers learned about sin, duty, charity, marriage, the roles of men and women, the dangers of pride, and the expectations of work. They learned about the afterlife in vivid detail, about the torments of hell and the joys of heaven. They heard stories of saints who performed miracles, martyrs who died for their faith, and biblical heroes who struggled and triumphed. These stories were designed to instruct as much as inspire. Each one reinforced the idea that obedience, humility, and devotion were the cornerstones of a righteous life. The Church also defined moral behavior with remarkable precision. Villagers were taught to confess their sins regularly, acknowledging failings both large and small. Confession required honesty, humility, and vulnerability before the priest, who acted as an intermediary between the sinner and God. The priest could grant absolution, assign penance, and provide spiritual guidance. Through this ritual, the Church gained insight into the private lives of every villager: marital conflicts, financial struggles, rivalries, temptations, and secret fears. Confession was not merely a personal act. It was a system of social regulation. The knowledge held by the priest, combined with the moral authority of the Church, shaped behavior as effectively as any law. But the Church did more than dictate morality. It defined the very structure of time. The medieval year was a tapestry of religious observances that governed when villagers worked, when they rested, what they ate, and how they celebrated. Lent demanded fasting and abstinence. Advent required preparation and reflection. All Saints' Day honored the dead. Feast days allowed rest from work and the enjoyment of communal meals. Rogation days sent villagers in procession through the fields, chanting prayers for protection against blight and storm. Even the pace of marriage, planting, and travel was influenced by the liturgical calendar. The Church's holidays were not suggestions. They were obligations rooted in divine authority. The measurement of time itself flowed from the Church. Bells rang not only for prayer, but for communal coordination. The Angelus bell marked morning, midday, and evening, guiding villagers through their routines. Weddings occurred after Mass. Funerals followed the tolling of a slow bell. The beginning and end of each workday were often announced by sound rather than sunlight. The bell tower stood as a primitive but effective timekeeping system, transforming the Church into the village's central clock long before mechanical clocks existed. As the Church directed the rhythms of time, it also controlled the rhythms of law. In many villages, the Church operated courts that addressed moral and social disputes. These ecclesiastical courts handled issues such as adultery, failure to attend Mass, disputes over marriage contracts, gossip, blasphemy, usury, and accusations of heresy. Unlike secular courts, which dealt with theft or land disputes, church courts focused on spiritual wrongdoing. Their punishments sought repentance rather than imprisonment. A sinner might be ordered to fast, to go on pilgrimage, to publicly confess wrongdoing, or to donate food to the poor. The objective was the restoration of harmony and the purification of the soul. Yet moral wrongdoing could have very real consequences in village life. A man labeled a notorious gossip might find his neighbors avoiding him. A woman accused of slander might be forced to stand before the congregation and beg forgiveness. A villager caught skipping Mass repeatedly could be fined or publicly reprimanded. Shame became a tool of control just as powerful as fear of divine punishment. Through these methods, the Church shaped not only spiritual behavior, but social dynamics within the community. Discipline, however, was balanced with comfort. The Church provided villagers with emotional and spiritual support during times of uncertainty. If crops failed, the priest led prayers for rain. If a family fell into poverty, the Church organized almsgiving. If a child died, a tragically common event, the Church offered rituals that helped parents cope with grief. In times of plague or famine, villagers did not turn to doctors or scientists, they turned to the Church. Prayer, penance, and ritual were seen as the most effective remedies for hardship. This reliance strengthened the Church's authority even further. The Church also controlled access to education, however scarce it was. Some priests taught basic reading or Latin to a few promising boys, preparing them for a possible clerical path. Monasteries served as centers of scholarship, copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge, and training clergy. But for most villagers, education remained out of reach. The Church determined who learned to read, who gained access to books, and who rose above the agricultural world that defined medieval life. Literacy became a tool of institutional power. Even the architecture of the church building reflected the Church's control. The nave, where villagers worshipped, was open and spacious. The chancel, where the priest performed sacred rituals, was elevated and separated, often by a rude screen painted with images of Christ, saints, and angels. This physical separation reminded villagers that holiness lay beyond their reach, mediated by the clergy. The church walls were often covered in paintings depicting heaven, hell, saints, and biblical stories, graphic visual reminders of spiritual truths. The goal was not only to teach, but to persuade, to shape thought through imagery as well as words. Every aspect of village life, birth, marriage, work, time, law, morality, education, celebration, suffering, and death, flowed through the Church's framework. It was impossible to live outside it. There was no alternate worldview, no competing institution, no secular authority that held greater influence over the everyday villager. The medieval English Church did not simply guide life, it defined it. To understand how deeply the Church shaped medieval village life, one must look not only at its rituals and teachings, but at its presence within the physical environment of daily existence. The church building itself dominated the landscape, often perched on the highest ground, its tower visible from fields far beyond the village boundary. In a time when structures were simple, cottages built from timber, daub, and thatch, the church stood apart, crafted from heavy stone meant to endure centuries. Its permanence contrasted sharply with the fragile homes of the villagers, reminding everyone that the realm of the sacred endured long after ordinary human lives had ended. The church bells were the voice of this towering structure. Their sound traveled for miles across open land, through forests, and over streams. To the villagers, the bells were more than instruments. They were commandments cast into sound. A single toll might call the community to morning prayers. Several rapid rings might signal danger or summon men to assist in a crisis. A slow, heavy toll announced death, spreading solemnity instantly through the village. The bells regulated not only time, but emotion, behavior, and collective movement. Villagers responded instinctively, long before they fully understood why. Inside the church, the environment spoke its own language. The air was cooler, heavy with the scent of incense burned during Mass and funerals. The floors were packed earth or stone slabs worn smooth by generations of feet. Light filtered in through small windows, creating long, shifting beams that illuminated painted saints, carved altars, or wooden crucifixes. Even those who rarely left their village stood within these walls, feeling part of something vastly larger than themselves, a connection to centuries of worshippers and to the unseen spiritual realm that defined medieval understanding. Mass was the centerpiece of religious life, though to most villagers, much of it was mysterious. The priest spoke in Latin, reciting prayers and performing rituals the villagers could not understand linguistically, but grasped through symbolism. They watched as he lifted the chalice, as he traced the sign of the cross, as he touched the altar and handled the sacred objects with reverence. The mystery itself reinforced the Church's authority. Something divine and powerful was happening, something only the priest could initiate. Villagers participated through responses, shared prayers, gestures, and kneeling at specific moments. Even if they did not grasp the theological nuances, they believed deeply in the efficacy of the ritual. Mass cleansed the soul, protected the community, and maintained the invisible connection between heaven and earth. To miss Mass was not merely a lapse in attendance. It was an act with spiritual consequences, one that risked the displeasure of both God and neighbor. Beyond Mass, the Church shaped life through sacrament. There were sacraments for nearly every stage of existence. Baptism welcomed a newborn into the Christian community, ensuring the infant's soul was safe, even if life was tragically short. Confirmation reinforced commitment to faith. Marriage bound couples not only to each other but to the Church's expectations, fidelity, obedience, and mutual support. Confession allowed sinners to cleanse their souls, guided by the priest's judgment and penance. Extreme unction prepared the dying for their final journey. These rituals structured the human life cycle, framing each transition within the Church's authority. The Church also played a central role in maintaining order and stability within the village. Moral behavior was closely tied to religious teaching, and the priest delivered weekly reminders of the consequences of sin. Villagers heard graphic descriptions of hell, stories of divine punishment, and examples of how minor moral failings could escalate into spiritual peril. These warnings reinforced communal expectations. A villager who stole from a neighbor risked not only social disgrace, but eternal damnation. A man who skipped Mass repeatedly signaled defiance not just to his community, but to God. Even small infractions, insulting a neighbor, gossiping maliciously, failing to fast on required days, carried moral significance. Yet the Church's authority was not maintained through fear alone. It also provided reassurance. Sermons emphasized the mercy of God, the intercession of saints, and the possibility of forgiveness. Villagers learned that suffering on earth could earn reward in heaven. Labor, poverty, illness, and hardship were interpreted not purely as misfortunes, but as spiritual tests or opportunities for grace. This interpretation gave villagers meaning in a life often marked by struggle. It allowed them to endure difficulties with a sense of purpose and connection to divine will. The Church also exercised influence through land ownership. Many villages sat on land owned by monasteries, bishops, or other ecclesiastical institutions. In such cases, villagers owed labor and rents not to a noble lord, but to the Church itself. Tithe barns, large wooden structures for storing the Church's share of the harvest, were common features of the landscape. Each villager was required to give 1/10 of their produce, whether grain, vegetables, fruit, wool, or livestock. This tithe was not optional. It was enforced by law, backed by both spiritual and secular authority. The requirement ensured the Church's financial strength while reinforcing its role as landlord and overseer. Monasteries, though often located outside individual villages, exerted a powerful presence. They owned mills where villagers ground their grain, fields where livestock grazed, forests where timber was cut, and fish ponds that provided food. Villagers might work on monastery land, participate in monastic festivals, or depend on monastic charity in times of need. Monks and nuns were separate from the everyday struggles of village life, but their labor, scholarship, and wealth shaped the broader economy. Some monasteries offered medical care or hospitality to travelers, while others served as centers of manuscript production. Their existence reminded villagers that devotion could take many forms and that the church's reach extended far beyond the parish priest. The church controlled what villagers believed about illness and healing. Sickness was understood as both physical affliction and spiritual trial. Remedies included herbal treatments, but prayers, holy water, and relics were equally important. Pilgrimages to shrines reputed to offer healing were common even among the poor. When disease swept through the village, as it often did, the church organized processions, prayers, and masses intended to ward off divine wrath. The belief that spiritual forces underpinned physical illness gave the church authority over health, just as it had authority over morality and time. The dead, too, remained under the church's governance. Burial within consecrated ground was essential for the salvation of the soul. Funerals included prayers for the deceased's journey through purgatory, where souls were believed to undergo purification before entering heaven. Villagers prayed for the dead, commissioned masses in their memory, and left offerings to speed their passage. The fear of dying without proper rites, of being buried outside holy ground or without confession, was profound. The Church's role in death gave it power not only over the living, but over the imagined landscape of the afterlife. In these ways, through architecture, ritual, land, law, morality, education, healing, and the management of life and death, the Church shaped every dimension of medieval village existence. It was an institution so pervasive that villagers rarely questioned its authority. It was simply the way the world worked. To understand how completely the Church permeated life in a medieval English village, one must explore how deeply it influenced people's understanding of the natural world. For villagers, the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was thin, permeable, and constantly active. Every storm, every illness, every successful harvest, every tragedy carried spiritual meaning. The Church shaped how villagers interpreted these signs, giving divine logic to events that modern minds would see as random or natural. A good harvest was never just the result of favorable weather, it was a blessing. A flood was never simply a force of nature, it was a warning or a punishment. When lightning struck a tree near the village, the priest might proclaim it a sign to repent. When a child recovered unexpectedly from fever, villagers attributed the miracle to saintly intervention. In this world view, God, angels, saints, and demons were not abstract beings, but active participants in daily life. The Church positioned itself as the interpreter of their actions. Field blessings illustrate this clearly. At certain times of the year, especially during rogation days, the priest led the villagers in procession through the fields, chanting prayers to protect crops from pests, drought, and disease. Holy water was sprinkled on the soil. Crosses were erected at field boundaries. These rituals reaffirmed the idea that the success of the harvest depended on divine favor. They also reinforced the priest's role as mediator between the villagers and God. Agriculture was not only a matter of labor, it was a spiritual endeavor. Weather patterns, too, were interpreted through the Church's teachings. If the winter was unusually harsh, it could be seen as a test of faith. If spring brought late frosts, villagers prayed for mercy. They did not understand meteorology, but they understood divine intention as conveyed by the clergy. When the church declared that sin within the community could bring divine retribution upon the land, villagers took the warning seriously. A single individual's wrongdoing could, in their eyes, imperil everyone. This belief created immense social pressure to maintain moral standards, not only for personal salvation, but for the survival of the community. The church also dictated how villagers viewed the landscape around them. Certain areas, churchyards, crossroads, streams near holy wells, were considered sacred or spiritually significant. The church blessed wells believed to have healing properties, transforming them into holy sites dedicated to saints. These wells became pilgrimage destinations, drawing villagers and travelers alike to seek cures for ailments. The act of pilgrimage, whether long distance or local, connected even the most isolated villagers to the broader network of Christian sites and traditions. On the other hand, some places were viewed with suspicion. Dense forests, marshes, and remote hills carried reputations as haunts of demons or wandering souls. The priest did not always invent these fears. Many pre-Christian beliefs lingered among the rural population, but the church reinforced and reframed them within Christian doctrine. Spirits that once belonged to folklore were reinterpreted as demons or lost souls in need of prayer. Natural dangers became spiritual dangers. By shaping these beliefs, the church also shaped behavior. Villagers avoided certain paths at night, not because of thieves, but because of fear of the supernatural. Even animals carried spiritual significance. A sudden swarm of insects could be interpreted as divine displeasure. A cow that refused to give milk might be suspected of being cursed or overlooked by saintly protection. The priest might be asked to bless livestock, especially during calving or lambing season. The church inserted itself into these aspects of rural life, offering rituals and prayers to safeguard the animals that sustained the village's economy. The spiritualization of the natural world also extended to illness and healing. Medieval villagers believed that the body and soul were deeply intertwined. Physical ailments were often seen as manifestations of spiritual imbalance or divine testing. The church did not oppose herbal remedies or practical care. Many priests and monks were knowledgeable in herbal medicine, but it framed healing within a spiritual context. A villager suffering from fever might receive both an herbal brew and a blessing. Someone plagued by nightmares might be given a charm or instructed to sleep with a particular prayer. Even childbirth, one of the most dangerous events of medieval life, was surrounded with prayers to saints who protected women in labor. In times of epidemic, the church's influence became even more pronounced. Villagers lacked understanding of contagion or sanitation. When sickness spread rapidly, they turned to the church for answers. Priests led processions through the village, reciting prayers to ward off disease. They urged repentance, fasting, and charity to appease divine anger. Churches became centers of communal fear and hope, filled with desperate prayers for deliverance. Whether or not these rituals were effective, they provided structure and meaning during periods of crisis. The church's role extended beyond interpreting natural events. It shaped how villagers imagined the afterlife. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were vividly real in medieval consciousness. Hell was described in terrifying detail: fire, demons, unending torment. Heaven was depicted as a realm of light, peace, and eternal joy. Between them lay purgatory, a place of purification for souls not yet ready for heaven. The Church taught that prayers, masses, and good deeds performed by the living could shorten the suffering of souls in purgatory. This belief created a powerful bond between the living and the dead. Villagers prayed for deceased relatives. They lit candles in church. They left offerings. They requested masses on anniversaries of death. These practices reinforced the church's role as guardian of the soul's journey. Even after death, villagers depended on the clergy to guide and intercede on their behalf. This extended the church's influence across the boundary between life and death. Fear of dying without proper rites was profound. A person who died unconfessed, outside consecrated ground, or without priestly blessing, risked wandering as a restless spirit or suffering prolonged torment in the afterlife. These fears shaped behavior. A villager feeling death near would urgently summon the priest, sometimes in the middle of the night. Entire households quieted themselves during a deathbed ritual, listening to the priest's prayers and preparing the soul for departure. Burials themselves were carefully regulated. Only the churchyard was considered holy ground. Graves oriented east-west symbolized readiness for resurrection at the second coming. Treatments of the dead, wrapping, prayers, masses, followed church instruction. In this way, the church not only controlled spiritual interpretation, but the physical handling of death. The influence of the church on medieval villagers cannot be separated from these deeply internalized beliefs about nature, health, and the afterlife. It shaped what people feared, what they hoped for, how they endured suffering, and how they made sense of events beyond their control. It was far more than an institution. It was the framework through which the medieval mind understood existence. To see the Church's full influence on medieval life, one must look closely at how it shaped social structures, who held authority, who held responsibility, and how villagers understood their place within the community. In a world without modern government systems, the Church provided an organizational framework that governed behavior, mediated relationships, and reinforced hierarchy. It functioned not merely as a religious institution, but as a social blueprint. Every village had its priest, and although he was often born into the same rural life as his parishioners, he operated within a higher tier of authority. He was the bridge between the ordinary villager and the vast, complex hierarchy of the church. Even in the smallest villages, the priest answered to the bishop, who in turn answered to archbishops and ultimately to Rome. This chain of authority underscored the idea that even the most remote hamlet was part of a larger spiritual realm. But daily life revolved not around distant bishops or faraway monasteries. It revolved around the priest's role within local society. He officiated at marriages, baptized infants, heard confessions, and conducted funerals. He taught doctrine, warned against sin, and interpreted events. Villagers turned to him for advice on moral dilemmas, disputes between families, and decisions involving land or inheritance. His influence extended far beyond the pulpit. It shaped the social fabric of the entire community. This influence was reinforced through rituals that required villagers to appear before the priest regularly. Attendance at Mass was expected. Participation in confession was necessary for salvation. Observance of feast days was required. When villagers sinned publicly, they performed public penance, often inside the church itself. These rituals reinforced social cohesion, teaching villagers that their missteps did not affect only themselves. They affected the entire community. A person who lived immorally could provoke divine wrath that impacted everyone. The Church also defined gender roles in ways that aligned with its teachings. Men were expected to serve as heads of households, responsible for ensuring that their families lived according to Christian values. Women were taught to be obedient, modest, and industrious. They were encouraged to model themselves after the Virgin Mary, patient, nurturing, and humble. Sermons reinforced these expectations, explaining that the order of society mirrored divine order. A household's spiritual condition was often judged by the behavior of its members, reflecting either positively or negatively on the father's leadership. Children, too, lived under the church's guidance from birth. Baptism marked a child as a Christian, and failure to baptize promptly was viewed as endangering the infant's soul. Children learned prayers before they learned letters. They acted as participants in religious processions and festivals, absorbing the rhythms of the liturgical year before they fully understood them. The Church shaped their understanding of obedience, morality, and the responsibilities of adulthood. Even play sometimes reflected religious influence. Games mimicked rituals, saints, stories, or tales of biblical heroes, much as modern children reenact scenes from movies or books. The Church's teachings also reinforced the feudal structure that defined medieval life. The priest taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained. Kings ruled because God permitted it. Lords governed because it was their appointed role. Peasants worked the land because such was their place in the cosmic order. Sermons often emphasized the importance of obedience to superiors, patience under hardship, and acceptance of one's social position. This worldview allowed the church and the ruling classes to maintain stability in a society with stark inequalities. At the same time, the church acted as a moral check on secular power. Lords were expected to rule justly, protect their tenants, and refrain from exploiting the vulnerable. Failure to meet these obligations could result in spiritual consequences. Priests sometimes reprimanded local lords in private, reminding them of their duties and the eternal consequences of greed or cruelty. Though the church often aligned with nobility, its moral authority gave it influence that even the powerful could not ignore. One of the most visible ways the church shaped village life was through festivals. Medieval villagers had few opportunities for leisure, but religious festivals provided communal celebration and relief from daily labor. These festivals punctuated the year, aligning with agricultural rhythms and saints' feast days. They were more than holidays, they were expressions of shared identity. On feast days, the churchyard filled with villagers dressed in their best clothing. Bells rang joyfully, processions wound through the village, carrying banners, crosses, and relics. Hymns filled the air, blending with the noise of laughter and conversation. After the religious ceremonies, festivities often continued with feasting, dancing, games, and communal meals. Saints' days honored the village's patron, reinforcing a sense of protection and collective belonging. These celebrations strengthened the social bonds that sustained the community through hardship. Even the smallest gestures of daily life reflected the church's presence. Villagers crossed themselves when passing the church. They blessed themselves before meals. They offered prayers for safe journeys. They made the sign of the cross over newborn animals. These actions became instinctive, woven into the fabric of life. The church did not demand constant piety. The villagers themselves embraced it as a natural response to living in a world they believed to be shaped by divine forces. The church also served as guardian of tradition. In a time of limited literacy, collective memory was preserved through sermons, rituals, and storytelling. Villagers learned about biblical history, saints' legends, and the lives of holy figures through spoken word and visual imagery. Painted walls inside the church depicted stories from Scripture. Stained glass illustrated concepts the villagers could not read. In this way, the church created continuity across generations. A villager born in 1250 heard the same stories and participated in the same rituals as a villager born in 1150 or 1050. Through this continuity, the church offered a sense of stability in an unpredictable world. The church even influenced how villagers interacted with the natural environment. water, fire, crops, and animals were all subject to blessings and rituals meant to ensure protection and success. Villagers believed that ignoring these rituals invited disaster. When the priest blessed fields, villagers followed him reverently. When he sprinkled holy water in cottages to ward off illness, families watched with gratitude. When storms threatened, bells were rung to ward off lightning, based on the belief that the sound disrupted demonic forces controlling the weather. At every level, household, village, and landscape, the church provided structure, meaning, and a sense of order. It taught villagers how to interpret the world, how to behave, how to endure suffering, and how to hope for redemption. It shaped their relationships, their responsibilities, their fears, and their joys. It was not simply an institution, it was the lens through which medieval villagers saw every aspect of existence. To fully grasp how the church controlled life in medieval English villages, one must examine how it shaped economics, not merely through tithes or donations, but through its deep integration into the entire structure of rural production, land use, and obligation. Economic life in a medieval village was inseparable from the church. Every field, every bushel of grain, every harvested sheep's fleece existed in a framework defined and overseen by ecclesiastical authority. The church's economic power began with land ownership. A significant portion of England's farmland was controlled by religious institutions, monasteries, abbeys, bishoprics, and parish churches. These lands were worked by villagers who owed labor, rent, or a portion of their harvest to the church. In many villages, the wealthiest and most fertile strips of land belonged to an abbey or cathedral chapter. The villagers who lived on or near these lands paid rents not to a secular lord, but to the church itself. This made the church not only a spiritual authority, but a landlord whose interests shaped agricultural cycles. Tithes formed another central component of ecclesiastical economic influence. Every villager, no matter how poor, was obligated to give 1/10 of their annual produce to the church. This included grain, vegetables, fruit, livestock, wool, dairy, and even honey from beekeepers. Tithes were stored in tithe barns, large structures that stood prominently within or near the village. These barns symbolized the church's material presence. They were often among the most substantial buildings in the countryside, rivaling or exceeding the scale of manor barns. The process of collecting tithes underscored the church's authority. Villagers brought their goods to the tithe barn each season, where the parish priest or an appointed official recorded contributions. This ritual reinforced the idea that the church was entitled to the fruits of their labor. The tithe was not a fee for services rendered. It was a divine obligation, backed by canon law. Failure to pay could result in penalties imposed by church courts, public shaming, or even spiritual sanctions. Through the tithe, the church maintained financial security regardless of fluctuations in harvest yields or local prosperity. But the church's economic reach extended far beyond tithes. Many essential services were ecclesiastical monopolies. Mills, where villagers ground their grain into flour, often belonged to the church. Villagers were required to use these mills and pay a fee known as multure, a portion of the flour produced. Even if a family possessed a small hand quern, using it was often forbidden under penalty of law. These restrictions ensured that milling profits flowed consistently to the church or the monastic landlords who owned the mill. Bakeries and ovens, too, were sometimes controlled by ecclesiastical landlords. Villagers who lacked their own ovens, common in poorer households, paid fees to use communal ovens, further reinforcing the church's role in everyday economic activity. Monasteries, particularly large ones, played a crucial role in regional economies. They owned vast tracts of land, skilled labor, and specialized industries. Some monasteries managed large sheep flocks, producing wool that was exported across Europe. Others operated breweries, wineries, smithies, or salt works. They employed local villagers as laborers, craftsmen, or servants. The wealth generated by these enterprises flowed back into the monastic community, supporting religious life, but also reinforcing the church's economic dominance. Pilgrimage sites were another source of income. Shrines dedicated to saints attracted travelers from across the region, bringing alms, offerings, and trade. Markets developed around these sites, generating revenue not only for the church, but for the surrounding economy. Villagers benefited indirectly, but the primary flow of wealth remained anchored in the religious institution that controlled the shrine. The church also dictated when economic activity could occur. Holy days required villagers to stop work, sometimes for dozens of days each year. While this offered welcome rest from constant labor, it also meant that agricultural tasks needed to be carefully planned around the liturgical calendar. Certain days prohibited plowing, harvesting, or threshing. Others required attendance at Mass or participation in processions. A villager who neglected these obligations risked spiritual penalties or social censure. The Church's control over marriage further influenced economic life. Marriage was not merely a personal union, it was a legal and economic contract that required priestly endorsement. The Church regulated who could marry, under what conditions, and how disputes or separations were handled. This had direct implications for land inheritance, property rights, and the formation of households. A marriage blocked by the Church, due to consanguinity rules or unresolved previous vows, could reshape entire family strategies for land and labor. The Church also guided charitable obligations. Almsgiving was not voluntary, it was a religious duty. Villagers were expected to give to the poor, support widows and orphans, and contribute to church-sponsored causes. These acts were not presented merely as kindness, but as spiritual investments that accumulated merit. Through this system, the Church became the primary manager of social welfare, distributing resources to the needy through a moral framework that reinforced religious values. Economic disputes often came before the Church rather than secular authorities. Questions about tithes, inheritance, promises, wills, and marriage contracts were litigated in ecclesiastical courts. These courts operated according to canon law, with the priest or bishop's representatives judging cases. Decisions were framed not only in economic terms, but in terms of spiritual obligation and moral behavior. A villager who violated a contract could be punished not only with fines, but with penance or public confession. This blending of economic and moral law strengthened the Church's ability to shape societal norms. Even the rhythms of the agricultural year were sanctified by Church practice. Blessings were performed before plowing began. Fields were sprinkled with holy water to protect crops. Prayers were offered for rain or sunshine. Failure to observe these rituals could be interpreted as risking divine displeasure, and therefore risking the harvest itself. In an economy where survival depended entirely on weather and timing, fear of divine retribution created powerful incentives to follow the Church's guidance. At the same time, the Church often acted as a stabilizing force in economic life. It offered charity during famine, mediated disputes over land, and provided structure during uncertain times. Monasteries distributed food to the poor. Priests organized community support for struggling families. Almsgiving ensured that resources circulated during hardship. In a subsistence economy, these interventions were vital. But one must note that this support also reinforced dependency. Villagers did not turn to a state welfare system or marketplace. They turned to the church. It was the institution that offered stability, but only within its framework of authority. The church's economic dominance was not an accident. It was a deliberate system woven into the fabric of medieval life. Through land ownership, tithes, monopolies on essential services, control of work schedules, regulation of marriage, and management of charity, the church shaped not only how villagers lived, but how they worked, traded, and survived. Economic dependency reinforced spiritual dependency, creating a cycle in which the church's influence became both natural and unquestioned. Another dimension of the church's control in medieval English villages was its influence over cultural life, stories, celebrations, customs, and the very way villagers imagined the world beyond their fields. It was the church that shaped their festivals, their fears, their understanding of morality, and their collective identity. Culture in a medieval village was not secular. It was inseparable from religious tradition. To begin, the church defined the rhythm of the calendar. Every season, every turning of the year, every significant moment was marked by a feast, a fast, or a holy observance. While agricultural labor shaped the practical needs of the village, the church shaped its emotional and spiritual landscape. Festivals brought joy, color, and celebration into lives otherwise marked by hard labor. One such festival was Candlemas, held in early February. On this day, villagers brought candles to the church to be blessed, believing that the light would protect their homes from storms, fire, and illness. The festival symbolized the return of light after the dark winter months. It combined practical need, illumination, with spiritual symbolism, reinforcing the idea that divine protection infused everyday objects. Another major celebration was Easter, the most important event in the Christian calendar. Villagers prepared for weeks, fasting during Lent, attending additional services, and engaging in acts of charity. The rituals of Holy Week, processions, the dramatization of Christ's Passion, the blessing of fire and water, immersed the entire community in a shared emotional experience. Easter was a time of renewal, not only spiritually, but socially. Friendships were mended, debts forgiven, and feuds reconciled. The festival served as a reset for communal harmony. Christmas, too, was a time of joy. While medieval celebrations lacked many modern traditions, the season was filled with feasting, singing, and ritual. Villagers gathered for midnight mass, shared special meals, and engaged in customs like the bringing of evergreen branches into homes to symbolize eternal life. Just as important as the religious meaning was the social unity created through these shared practices. Beyond these major holidays, numerous saints' days punctuated the year. Every village had a patron saint, whose feast day was celebrated with processions, games, special masses, and sometimes fairs or markets. These saints were not abstract figures. They were believed to actively protect the village, intervene in crises, and guide moral behavior. Stories of their miracles were retold at festivals and sermons. Children learned their virtues by heart. The patron saint was a symbol of collective identity, tying the community to a broader spiritual heritage. The church also shaped how villagers understood the supernatural. Medieval people lived in a world alive with invisible forces, angels, demons, wandering souls, heavenly omens, and divine interventions. The Church interpreted these forces, defining which beliefs were acceptable and which were forbidden. Some older pagan practices persisted in rural areas, but the Church absorbed and reinterpreted many of them. Wells dedicated to ancient spirits became Christian holy wells. Seasonal rituals marking solstices or harvests were rebranded as religious processions. In this way, the Church did not erase local traditions, it transformed them. Fear played a role in shaping cultural life. Sermons often warned of the dangers of sin, describing vividly the torments of hell. These warnings created a moral imaginative world in which disobedience had terrifying consequences. The Church used these fears to reinforce discipline, but they also created a shared cultural language. Tales of devils tempting villagers, saints rescuing the faithful, and sinners suffering divine punishment were recounted as moral lessons. They were repeated in church, in fields, and around hearths at night. Yet fear was balanced by hope. The Church taught villagers that saints, angels, and Christ himself could intervene to protect the faithful. This belief gave comfort during crises, storms, illness, famine, or conflict. Villagers prayed to specific saints for specific needs: Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Anthony for lost objects, Saint Christopher for safe travel. These devotions created a sense that divine assistance was always within reach, reinforcing reliance on the Church. Music and art were also shaped by religious influence. Church services included chants, hymns, and simple liturgical melodies that villagers learned by repetition. Although most villagers did not read musical notation, they internalized the rhythms of sacred music. On feast days, songs filled the village green. Children sang rhyming verses about saints and biblical stories. Even work songs sometimes included religious references, blending the sacred with the mundane. Inside the church, art provided visual instruction. Wall paintings depicted scenes of the Last Judgment, saints' lives, biblical miracles, and moral allegories. These paintings were not decorative, they were teaching, tools for an illiterate population. Villagers learned theology through images: demons dragging souls into hell, Christ seated in glory, Noah's ark afloat on floodwaters. These visuals shaped their imagination as deeply as sermons shaped their intellect. Drama also emerged from religious tradition. Church-sponsored plays, known as mystery plays or miracle plays, dramatized biblical stories. While full cycles of plays were common in towns, villages sometimes hosted smaller performances, especially during major festivals. These plays brought stories to life: Noah arguing with his wife, shepherds visiting the Christ child, devils dragging sinners to torment. They entertained, educated, and reinforced moral lessons. The Church influenced not only what stories villagers heard, but how they understood personal identity. Medieval villagers did not see themselves as individuals in the modern sense. They were members of families, households, and communities, but above all, they were members of a Christian society under God's authority. Their identity was tied to their place in the divine order. Life was seen as a journey toward salvation, with the Church providing direction. Even naming practices reflected religious influence. Children were often named after saints: John, Mary, Peter, Margaret, Thomas, Catherine. These names connected individuals to holy figures believed to watch over them. Feast days determined when baptisms occurred. Certain saints' days were considered auspicious for marriages, planting, or travel. The Church controlled the moral stories that guided behavior, the festivals that punctuated the year, the music villagers sang, and the art that shaped their imagination. Through culture, it entered the deepest layers of consciousness. It shaped how villagers saw themselves, their purpose, and the world beyond their fields. Even when villagers laughed, celebrated, or relaxed, they did so within a framework defined by religious customs. The Church's cultural authority was not imposed through force, it was woven into tradition. It persisted because it offered meaning, identity, and continuity in a world of uncertainty. In shaping culture, the church shaped people. One of the most profound ways the church controlled medieval village life was through its interpretation of morality. What was right, what was sinful, and what the consequences of moral failure would be. These were not abstract philosophical ideas. They were practical instructions that guided daily decisions, shaped relationships, and defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior. For the medieval villager, morality was not a personal code, nor was it enforced primarily by secular law. It was a religious framework upheld by the Church's constant presence and articulated through its teachings, rituals, and institutions. Sin, in the medieval worldview, was not merely a moral failing. It was a spiritual danger that threatened the individual soul and, by extension, the entire community. Every wrongful act, whether theft, dishonesty, pride, lust, gluttony, or envy, was believed to damage the soul and distance the sinner from God. The Church categorized sins with remarkable precision, distinguishing mortal sins, which endangered salvation, from venial sins, which weakened the soul but did not sever the connection to grace. These distinctions mattered deeply to villagers who believed their eternal fate depended on avoiding mortal sin and repairing the harm caused by lesser sins. Sermons delivered each Sunday reinforced this worldview. The priest explained the nature of sin, illustrated it with biblical stories, and warned of the eternal consequences. Hell was not a vague concept to medieval villagers. It was described with vivid, terrifying detail. Paintings inside the church depicted demons dragging souls into fiery pits, torturing them with hooks, chains, and flames. These images served as constant reminders of what awaited those who strayed from the path of righteousness. But morality in medieval villages was not only about eternal punishment, it was about maintaining social order. When the Church taught that anger, gossip, and slander were sinful, it discouraged behavior that could disrupt community harmony. When it condemned adultery, it protected family stability and inheritance lines. When it warned against greed, it reinforced norms of sharing and cooperation. Moral teaching was inseparable from practical governance. Confession played a central role in maintaining this moral framework. Villagers were required to confess their sins at least once a year, though many confessed more frequently. Confession was an intimate ritual demanding honesty and humility before the priest. It was through confession that the Church became aware of private transgressions, grievances, and inner struggles. The priest listened, judged the sincerity of repentance, and assigned penance to repair the spiritual harm done. Penance varied depending on the nature of the sin. A liar might be instructed to fast for a day. A gossip might be required to make public apology. Someone guilty of theft might be ordered to return what was taken and give additional alms to the poor. Those guilty of serious offenses, such as adultery or violence, might be required to undertake a pilgrimage, sometimes a long and physically demanding journey meant to foster humility and spiritual renewal. Through penance, the Church did more than forgive sin. It directed behavior. It shaped villagers' understanding of accountability and guided them toward reconciliation with both God and community. The process reinforced the priest's authority as moral judge, confessor, and spiritual advisor. The Church also shaped villagers' understanding of virtues, the qualities that defined a good Christian life. Humility, charity, patience, chastity, obedience, and compassion were emphasized repeatedly. Villagers admired these virtues not because they were philosophical ideals, but because the Church taught that they reflected the nature of Christ and the saints. Those who embodied these virtues were promised reward in heaven and respect within the community. Charity, in particular, was central to village life. Giving to the poor was considered a sacred duty. Villagers shared food, firewood, and clothing with those in need. This practice was not purely altruistic. It was believed to accumulate spiritual merit that could assist the giver's soul in the afterlife. Almsgiving tied the community together through mutual dependence while reinforcing the Church's emphasis on compassion as a moral obligation. The Church also regulated sexual behavior with strict rules. Premarital sex, adultery, and even certain marital acts were condemned. Marriage itself required priestly oversight. Couples married without church approval risked their union being declared invalid. The Church monitored betrothals, bans, and marriage contracts. It determined who could marry whom, enforcing rules against marrying within certain degrees of kinship. Sexual morality was not solely about personal virtue. It ensured legitimate inheritance and stable households. The Church's influence extended even to thoughts and emotions. Envy, pride, and wrath were condemned not merely as feelings, but as states that endangered the soul. The medieval villager learned to regulate emotions according to Church teaching. Feelings that today might be considered natural human reactions were, in the medieval worldview, potential spiritual dangers requiring discipline, confession, and guidance. Community pressure reinforced these moral teachings. Villagers watched each other closely. A woman who skipped Mass repeatedly or behaved immodestly could face gossip or corrective intervention. A man who drank excessively or quarreled with neighbors risked losing reputation. Because villagers lived in such close quarters, moral failure was hard to hide, and the Church did not hesitate to address public sin with public penance. Disputes, too, often fell under the Church's moral domain. When neighbors quarreled, the priest acted as mediator, listening to grievances and urging reconciliation. He reminded both parties of the spiritual consequences of holding grudges. Forgiveness was framed not simply as an emotional resolution, but as a moral and spiritual requirement. The priest emphasized that refusing to forgive jeopardized the soul, for God forgave only those who forgave others. Even economic practices were moralized. Usury, charging excessive interest, was forbidden. Cheating customers, using false measures, or hoarding grain during famine were condemned as sins of greed. The Church taught that economic activity must be governed by fairness and compassion, not profit alone. These teachings shaped village markets, trade relationships, and financial disputes. The Church's moral authority reached into every corner of life because it was seen as the guardian of the soul. Its teachings offered a coherent system of right and wrong. They provided explanations for suffering, pathways to redemption, and rules for maintaining social harmony. Villagers internalized these teachings from childhood, absorbing them through sermons, rituals, stories, and the constant presence of the Church in daily life. The result was a moral worldview deeply rooted in religious doctrine. Villagers interpreted their own behavior, and the behavior of others, through the lens of sin, virtue, and divine judgment. Actions were not evaluated merely in terms of practical consequences, but in terms of eternal significance. This gave the Church extraordinary power over hearts and minds. Another crucial aspect of the Church's influence in medieval English villages, and perhaps one of the least discussed, was its role in controlling knowledge. In a world where literacy was rare, where books were almost non-existent outside of monasteries, and where oral tradition carried the weight of history, the Church held a near monopoly on information, interpretation, and education. This intellectual control shaped how villagers understood the world, how they made decisions, and how they defined truth itself. To begin with, literacy was a privilege restricted to a tiny minority. The vast majority of villagers, men and women alike, could not read or write. Even among the priesthood, levels of education varied dramatically. But compared to the laity, the priest stood as a scholar, one of the few who had access to written texts, biblical manuscripts, and the teachings of church authorities. Because Scripture existed only in Latin, villagers depended entirely on the priest to interpret its meaning. They could not verify his explanations, compare interpretations, or engage with the text directly. Their spiritual understanding was mediated by someone whose authority derived precisely from this exclusive access. The Church determined not only what was true, but what questions could even be asked. It framed the mysteries of creation, the nature of the soul, the workings of the cosmos, and the structure of society within a religious worldview. Villagers learned that the universe was designed by God in a fixed hierarchy: God above the angels, angels above humanity, men above women, lords above peasants, and clergy above all in matters of salvation. This worldview did not encourage social mobility, scientific inquiry, or political dissent. Instead, it reinforced stability through a cosmology that mirrored the rigid social structure of village life. In many villages, the priest provided the only form of instruction available. He taught basic prayers to children, sometimes instructed boys in the alphabet or simple Latin phrases, and offered moral lessons through stories and sermons. But this instruction was not aimed at broad literacy. It was aimed at reinforcing religious truths. The priest selected what stories to tell, which virtues to emphasize, which warnings to repeat. Education was not about questioning the world, it was about learning one's place within it. Even village memory, its history, traditions, and lineage, passed through the Church's hands. The priest kept records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. He noted disputes, property transfers, and oaths sworn. These records formed the backbone of the community's legal and historical memory, and they were stored within the church, the most stable building in the village. Without the church's archives, a village had no written history at all. Church art served as another medium of instruction. Paintings on church walls depicted biblical narratives such as the creation, the fall, the flood, the passion, and the last judgment. These images acted as silent teachers, conveying stories and moral lessons to those who could not read. Visual symbolism was powerful. Saints with halos signified holiness. Demons with grotesque features symbolized sin. Scales weighing souls conveyed judgment. Because these images were sanctioned by the Church, villagers learned to trust them as representations of spiritual truth. Stained glass windows, though more common in larger churches, offered similar instruction through vivid colors and carefully crafted scenes. Light passing through the glass was itself symbolic of divine illumination. Villagers believed they were receiving not just sunlight, but spiritual enlightenment. The Church understood the emotional impact of imagery and used it deliberately to shape belief. The Church's control of knowledge extended to explanations of natural phenomena. Without scientific frameworks, villagers relied on religious explanations for everything from eclipses to illness. When the sun darkened unexpectedly, it was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. When crops failed, it was seen as punishment. When a meteor streaked across the sky, villagers sought the priest to understand its meaning. The Church did not compete with scientific authority. It was the scientific authority of the age. This control extended to medicine. While herbalists and midwives held local knowledge of healing, the Church determined what forms of healing were spiritually acceptable. Some remedies were blessed, others were condemned as superstition or sorcery. The line between acceptable natural medicine and forbidden magic was drawn by the clergy. As a result, Villagers often avoided treatments that might have been effective, fearing accusations of witchcraft or sin. Instead, they sought cures that aligned with church teaching, holy water, relics, pilgrimages, prayers, and blessings. The church also served as the arbiter of acceptable stories. Tales that contradicted Christian doctrine were suppressed or reframed. Legends of local spirits, ancient pagan deities, or ancestral ghosts were reinterpreted as demonic or spiritually dangerous. The church incorporated some elements of folklore, renaming sacred springs after saints, transforming seasonal festivals into Christian observances, but it carefully filtered the narratives to align with orthodoxy. Over generations, villagers came to believe that what the church taught was the only truth that had ever existed. The pulpit was the most powerful information platform in the medieval world. Sermons were not casual, they were crafted to instruct, warn, inspire, and control. Priests preached about the dangers of sin, the suffering of Christ, the lives of saints, and the punishments awaiting the wicked. They warned against heresy, questioned disobedience, and urged submission to authority. Through these sermons, the church shaped public opinion, resolved disputes, and reinforced social norms. Periodic visitations by bishops added another layer of control. When a bishop visited a village, he inspected the church, questioned the priest, and addressed the villagers. His arrival was a significant event, accompanied by ceremony and sometimes fear. Bishops audited the moral and spiritual condition of the parish, ensuring that church doctrine was being enforced. Their authority extended not only over priests, but over the entire community. Knowledge control also affected how villagers perceived time. Without clocks, they relied on the church to regulate hours. The ringing of the bell marked morning prayers, midday, vespers, and nightfall. Time was not measured in minutes or hours, but in sacred intervals. This alignment of timekeeping with religious practice ensured that villagers' lives followed a rhythm set by the church rather than by personal preference or secular demands. Finally, the church controlled knowledge of salvation, the most important knowledge of all. It taught that only through the church could a soul be cleansed, redeemed, and welcomed into heaven. Understanding the path to salvation required accepting church doctrine, participating in sacraments, confessing sins, performing penance, and obeying moral commands. Villagers did not question this system because no alternative existed. The church defined the ultimate truth, what life meant, how death worked, and what lay beyond. By controlling literacy, narrative, education, moral teaching, explanations of nature, timekeeping, and the very meaning of existence, the church shaped medieval worldview at its deepest level. Villagers lived within a cognitive world curated by religious authority. They interpreted daily events through frameworks taught by the church. Their knowledge was not fragmented or contradictory. It was unified under a single institution that claimed divine legitimacy. The Church's authority in medieval English villages also reached into the legal sphere, shaping how justice was understood, administered, and enforced. While secular courts handled crimes such as theft, assault, and disputes over land ownership, the Church exercised legal power over matters of morality, marriage, inheritance, and spiritual misconduct. These ecclesiastical courts created a parallel legal system that governed the inner and outer life of the villager, one rooted not in king's laws or baronial decrees, but in canon law, which the Church claimed was ordained by God. To the medieval villager, the Church's court was often the more immediate and accessible authority. Secular courts might sit miles away under the jurisdiction of a lord or royal official, but the church court functioned within the village or nearby. The priest, who knew everyone personally, could summon individuals for moral infractions or spiritual obligations. Attendance was mandatory. The church's ability to enforce penance, issue fines, or declare someone excommunicated gave it far-reaching influence, far beyond the walls of the church itself. One of the most common cases heard by church courts involved marriage. Marriage was considered a sacrament, not merely a contract. The church controlled who could marry, how marriages were formalized, and how disputes were resolved. Couples could not marry within certain degrees of kinship, even if the relationship was distant or forgotten. If the church discovered such a connection after the marriage, it could declare the union invalid. Marriages conducted without witnesses or without proper readings of the banns, the public announcements made during Mass, were also subject to investigation. Disputes over dowries, promises of betrothal, and accusations of infidelity came before the ecclesiastical court. A broken promise to marry could result in public penance. A man accused of adultery might be ordered to undergo fasting or donate money to the poor. A woman whose fidelity was questioned might be required to prove her innocence through oath-taking before the priest. The Church's attention to marital morality reinforced its control over family structures, inheritance lines, and social reputation. Another major category of cases involved moral offenses: slander, gossip, drunkenness, neglect of religious obligations, or quarrels that disrupted community harmony. Secular courts did not concern themselves with such matters, but the Church saw them as threats to spiritual health and social order. Someone who spread rumors could be called before the priest to confess and make restitution through public apology. A villager who habitually skipped Mass or refused confession could face spiritual penalties, including excommunication, the most serious punishment available to the Church. Excommunication was feared deeply. It cut a person off from the sacraments, from burial in consecrated ground, and from the support of the Christian community. Villagers believed that an excommunicated soul risked eternal damnation. Socially, it was devastating. Neighbors might avoid the excommunicated person. Participation in village life became difficult or impossible. The threat of this punishment gave the Church tremendous power to enforce compliance. The Church also handled disputes over wills and inheritance. Because writing was rare, wills were often dictated to the priest or recorded in church registers. Villagers trusted the Church to preserve these documents. When a family contested a will or claimed that promises had been broken, the church court intervened. It also ensured that the dead received proper burial rites and that any bequests made to the church were honored. This dual role, in managing both spiritual and material assets, gave the church significant leverage during times of transition or conflict. Accusations of heresy, though rare in small villages, represented another legal avenue through which the Church maintained control. Heresy was not merely a disagreement with doctrine, it was considered a threat to the unity of Christendom and the salvation of souls. While most English villagers never encountered organized heretical movements, the Church used the fear of heresy to reinforce obedience. A villager who challenged church authority or questioned doctrine risked being viewed with suspicion. Even minor deviations from accepted practice could attract unwanted attention. The Church's legal reach extended to its own officials as well. Clergy accused of misconduct, drunkenness, improper financial management, or immoral behavior were tried in church courts rather than secular ones. This protection reinforced the idea that the Church was self-governing, accountable only to its own hierarchy and ultimately to God. Villagers witnessed this autonomy and learned that spiritual authority operated outside the constraints of secular law. In addition to formal legal proceedings, the Church influenced behavior through public ritual. Villagers who committed offenses might be required to perform acts of public penance, standing barefoot in the churchyard, carrying candles during Mass, or confessing sins before the congregation. These rituals served both as punishment and as moral instruction. They reminded the community of the consequences of wrongdoing and reinforced the church's role in maintaining order. The parish priest held an informal but significant legal role as well. Villagers frequently brought disputes to him before turning to secular authorities. His counsel carried weight not because he held legal office, but because he represented spiritual wisdom and divine guidance. A priest who urged reconciliation could prevent long-lasting feuds. One who mediated disagreements over land boundaries or debts could prevent the escalation of conflict. Through such interventions, the Church's influence permeated even the smallest interpersonal dynamics. Monastic institutions also exercised legal power. Monasteries that owned land held their own manorial courts, where tenants were required to appear for issues related to rent, labor obligations, and local regulations. These courts enforced rules that protected ecclesiastical property and ensured the monastery's economic interests. In practice, this meant that villagers living on monastic land navigated both secular and religious jurisdictions simultaneously, with the Church often holding the final word. What distinguished ecclesiastical law from secular law, in the minds of villagers, was its moral authority. Secular courts enforced order. Church courts enforced righteousness. Secular courts protected property. Church courts protected souls. A ruling from a church court carried spiritual weight, not just legal force. It addressed not only the consequences of an action, but its meaning. Villagers accepted ecclesiastical judgments because they believed they reflected God's will. The blending of religious doctrine with legal authority created a powerful system of social control. It shaped villagers' sense of justice, their understanding of right and wrong, and their expectations of one another. It ensured that disputes were resolved within a moral framework. It preserved the Church's authority as both guardian of the soul and regulator of daily life. In essence, the Church functioned as a court, a judge, and a moral compass. Its laws governed the unseen world of the spirit as well as the visible world of human relationships. By controlling both realms, the Church maintained an unparalleled level of influence over medieval English villagers, an influence rooted not in coercion alone, but in belief. Another essential dimension of the Church's control over medieval village life was its ability to define and regulate the boundaries between acceptable spirituality and dangerous superstition. While villagers lived in a world filled with mystery, storms, sickness, crop failure, unusual dreams, strange noises at night, they also lived under a religious institution that insisted on being the gatekeeper of all spiritual interpretation. The Church not only prescribed what people should believe, it also actively condemned practices it considered harmful, heretical, or rooted in pre-Christian traditions. To a medieval villager, the world was a place alive with invisible forces. Angels watched over the righteous. Demons lurked near the careless and the sinful. Restless spirits wandered the margins of the village. The boundary between the physical and the supernatural was permeable, yet not all of these beliefs were sanctioned by the Church. Many were remnants of ancient folklore passed down through generations long before Christianity came to England. These beliefs existed in tension with the Church's teachings, and the Church worked constantly to shape, redirect, or suppress them. One of the primary tools the Church used to control spirituality was preaching. Priests warned villagers against invoking local spirits, using charms that had not been blessed by the Church, or performing rituals not recognized by canon law. They condemned practices such as placing offerings at old trees or springs, interpreting dreams without clerical guidance, or seeking cures from cunning folk, local practitioners who blended herbal knowledge with magical traditions. Such activities were labeled as superstitions or, worse, demonic influences. But despite these warnings, superstition persisted at the margins of medieval life. Villagers lived close to nature and often turned to whatever means were available when facing illness or misfortune. They tied protective knots around their children's necks, placed iron objects near beds to ward off spirits, or whispered charms taught by their grandparents. Many villagers saw no contradiction between these practices and attending Mass. To them, they were simply layers of protection in a dangerous world. The Church, however, drew a firm line between approved and forbidden practices. Holy water, blessed candles, relics of saints, and prayers were permitted, encouraged even. These were tools the Church offered to protect against evil. Everything else was suspicious. Even simple herbal remedies could be condemned if accompanied by spoken charms or rituals not endorsed by the Church. A woman who cured a neighbor's fever with herbs might be praised, but if she whispered a rhyme over the brew, she risked accusation of witchcraft. Witchcraft, as understood in the medieval village, was not yet the full demonological concept that would emerge in later centuries. Still, the Church condemned harmful magic, practices believed to manipulate the supernatural for personal gain or harm. A villager accused of cursing livestock or casting spells over crops could be brought before the priest for questioning. Confessions were demanded, repentance was required. Severe cases were referred to higher ecclesiastical authorities. Although executions for witchcraft were rare at this time, the fear of being labeled a practitioner of forbidden magic hung over those who deviated too far from church-sanctioned spirituality. The Church also attempted to suppress older pagan festivals and customs, though these efforts often led to compromise rather than elimination. Many pre-Christian traditions were simply reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Sacred wells were rededicated to saints. Seasonal festivals marking the solstices were transformed into Christian feast days. Bonfires meant to ward off spirits were incorporated into celebrations of St. John's Eve. The Church understood that eradication was impossible, transformation was more effective. As a result, medieval spirituality was a layered mixture of Christian doctrine and ancient tradition, with the Church claiming authority over the entire tapestry. Even the concept of ghosts was reshaped by the Church. While villagers believed strongly in wandering spirits, the Church reframed these beliefs within the doctrine of purgatory. Souls, it taught, did not wander aimlessly. They underwent purification. If they appeared, it was to request prayers, masses, or charity to shorten their suffering. This teaching redirected fear toward religious devotion, turning ghost stories into moral lessons that reinforced Church authority. Dreams, too, fell under the Church's domain. Villagers often saw dreams as omens or messages, but the Church insisted that dreams must be interpreted cautiously. A dream inspired by God was possible but rare. Most dreams, priests warned, were the product of bodily imbalance or demonic deception. Villagers who shared dreams with the priest learned to interpret them in ways that reinforced Church teachings, whether as warnings against sin, calls to repentance, or reminders of the fragility of life. Signs in nature, comets, eclipses, storms, were also given religious meaning. The Church framed them as divine messages rather than random events. A comet could signify God's displeasure. An eclipse might warn of coming hardship. These interpretations reinforced the idea that villagers must remain obedient and devout to avoid calamity. The natural world became another tool through which the church taught spiritual vigilance. The church took a particularly strong stance against divination, attempts to predict the future through casting lots, reading omens, or using objects such as bones or stones. These practices were condemned as attempts to intrude upon God's domain. Villagers caught engaging in divination could be forced to confess, pay fines, or perform public penance. The Church insisted that the future was known only to God and that attempts to foresee it were spiritually dangerous. Yet, even as it suppressed certain practices, the Church provided alternatives that fulfilled similar psychological needs. Villagers who sought protection could purchase blessed charms from the priest or visit shrines dedicated to saints. Those who feared illness could receive holy water. Those seeking guidance could attend confession or request pastoral counsel. The Church created a spiritual ecosystem that absorbed the functions of older traditions while maintaining strict control over their acceptable forms. By defining orthodoxy and heresy, piety and superstition, sanctioned ritual and forbidden magic, the Church shaped how villagers navigated the unseen world. It provided a sense of clarity in a world filled with uncertainty. Villagers learned to fear practices outside the Church's approval because they believed such acts invited demonic involvement or divine punishment. This created a powerful self-regulating mechanism. People policed not only their own behavior, but the behavior of others, reporting suspicious activity to the priest or confronting neighbors whose actions seemed spiritually risky. In this way, the Church's influence extended beyond formal teaching. It cultivated a culture of vigilance, where villagers internalized the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden practices. They became participants in maintaining the Church's authority, reinforcing the institution's control even when priests were not physically present. The medieval villager lived in a spiritual landscape shaped by ancient tradition but governed by the Church's rules. Even beliefs that predated Christianity were reframed, moderated, or suppressed to fit within a Christian worldview. The Church had no need to extinguish every superstition. It only needed to claim the right to judge which ones were safe and which ones were sinful. Through this dynamic, the Church became the ultimate arbiter of spiritual truth. It controlled the imagination, the fears, the hopes, and the very ways villagers interpreted the unseen forces that shaped their lives. As powerful as the Church was in shaping spirituality, law, morality, and knowledge, its influence extended just as deeply into the daily routines of medieval village life. To modern eyes, daily chores may seem purely practical: plowing, cooking, tending animals, repairing tools. But in the medieval worldview, these everyday tasks were woven into a sacred rhythm established by the Church. Work was not merely economic activity, it was a moral obligation, a divine calling, and a ritual that reflected one's place in God's order. The Church taught that labor itself was sanctified. Work was a consequence of humanity's fall from Eden, but it was also a path toward spiritual discipline. Priests reminded villagers that God valued hard work, patience, and diligence. Idleness was a sin. Laziness invited temptation. Villagers absorbed this message from an early age, learning to see their chores not as burdens, but as duties essential to the well-being of the household and, ultimately, their own souls. Even the structure of the workday reflected the Church's rhythm. The ringing of the church bell marked the beginning of the morning's tasks. Another bell at midday signaled a pause for prayer. Evening bells told villagers when to finish their work and return home. These bells reinforced the connection between physical labor and spiritual observance. A villager's day was not divided by hours, but by sacred intervals that brought work and worship into harmony. The church played a role in defining the agricultural calendar as well. Certain tasks were associated with specific saints' days. Plowing often began after the feast of St. Brigid. Lambing was blessed around the feast of St. Blaise. Harvesting took place between the feast of St. Peter and the feast of St. Michael. These associations gave villagers a framework for understanding the timing of essential tasks and ensured that agriculture aligned with religious observance. The church also determined when labor must cease. On holy days, of which there were many, the church required villagers to abstain from work. This was not a simple request. Failing to observe a holy day could be considered sinful. These rest days provided necessary breaks in an otherwise relentless agricultural schedule, but they also reinforced the church's authority over time and labor. Even during harvest, when every hour counted, villagers were expected to stop for mass, prayer, and ritual observances. Meals, too, were guided by ecclesiastical rules. Fasting days required abstinence from meat and sometimes from dairy and eggs. Lent restricted certain foods for weeks. Advent demanded moderation. Every villager, regardless of wealth, observed these fasting rules, which shaped not only diet, but social behavior. Feasts following periods of fasting became communal celebrations, reminding villagers of the cyclical nature of deprivation and abundance in both physical and spiritual life. Inside the home, the church influenced domestic chores. Women began their mornings with prayers while rekindling the hearth. Children recited blessings before eating. Families marked the opening and closing of the day with devotions that aligned their work with divine approval. Even mundane actions like sweeping the floor or kneading dough were seen as fulfilling God's purpose by maintaining a clean and orderly household. The church also shaped how villagers approached childbirth and childcare. Women prayed to specific saints for safe delivery. Midwives sometimes received the priest's blessing before assisting in labor. Baptism followed within days, sometimes within hours of birth. The urgency of baptism reflected the church's belief in original sin and the vulnerability of a newborn's soul. Parents were taught to guard their children from spiritual danger through regular blessings, attendance at Mass, and teaching them basic prayers. Animals, an essential part of village life, were not exempt from spiritual oversight. Livestock received blessings during Rogation Tide. Horses were blessed on St. Leonard's Day. Herds were sprinkled with holy water to protect them from disease. The church encouraged villagers to see animals not merely as property, but as creatures under divine care. When illness struck a flock or herd, villagers sought the priest's intervention alongside practical remedies. Tools and equipment also fell under the church's domain. Before plowing season began, farmers sometimes brought their plows to the churchyard to be blessed. Blacksmiths might ask the priest to bless their forge, believing it protected their work from misfortune. Fishermen prayed before outings. Craftsmen sought divine assistance during difficult projects. In this way, labor became an extension of worship. The church's influence extended beyond routine work into moments of crisis. When drought threatened crops, the priest led processions through the fields, chanting prayers for rain. When storms approached, bells were rung to ward off evil forces believed to ride upon the wind. When illness spread, villagers joined the priest in special devotions, fasting, or acts of charity in hopes of appeasing divine displeasure. The church's presence even shaped leisure. Singing, dancing, and games were permitted on certain feast days, but discouraged on Sundays or during solemn seasons. Drinking ale was acceptable in moderation, but condemned when excessive. Festivals included both religious and recreational components, demonstrating how the church allowed joy while maintaining moral boundaries. Education, or the lack of it, also structured daily life. Children learned not through schools, but through observation and participation. The church served as the primary source of instruction in reading, writing, and moral reasoning. Boys who showed promise might receive basic literacy training from the priest, sometimes preparing for a clerical path. Girls were taught domestic skills within a framework of religious duty, obedience, modesty, and chastity. Dispute resolution likewise unfolded within a religious structure. When villagers quarreled over boundaries, debt, or insults, they often brought their complaint to the priest before turning to secular authority. The priest's guidance aimed not just at settling the issue, but at restoring moral harmony. He urged forgiveness, charity, and penance when necessary. Through this, the church acted as a mediator, reinforcing its role as the moral and social center of the community. Even sleep carried spiritual significance. Villagers prayed before bed, asking for protection from nightmares, demons, and restless spirits. They believed that sleep exposed the soul to danger, and that only divine protection could ensure rest without spiritual harm. Morning prayers thanked God for safely passing through the vulnerability of night. In every task, working, eating, resting, caring for children, tending animals, resolving disputes, celebrating, mourning, the church provided the framework through which villagers understood their actions. Even when performing chores that had existed long before Christianity reached England, villagers interpreted these tasks through religious meaning. This integration of faith and routine created a world in which the church was always present, always guiding, always shaping life's smallest moments. The church's control over daily life was not enforced through constant instruction or surveillance. It was embedded in habit, tradition, and worldview. It shaped not only how villagers lived, but how they thought about living. The influence of the church did not end at the boundaries of the visible world. It also extended into the realm of death and what came after, a realm that held immense power in the medieval imagination. For villagers who lived with constant reminders of mortality, disease, accidents, famine, and the unpredictability of life, the church's teachings about the afterlife were not distant theology. They were urgent, practical truths that shaped behavior, decisions, and hopes. To the medieval villager, death was not a remote possibility, but an ever-present companion. Children died frequently. Adults succumbed to infections, fevers, or injuries that today would be easily treated. Old age was rare. The average villager might witness several deaths each year, sometimes within their own household. In this context, the Church's teachings about salvation, damnation, and purgatory carried enormous weight. They made sense of the world's fragility and offered a path, however narrow, toward eternal peace. The Church taught that every soul faced judgment immediately after death. A righteous life led to heaven, though entry was seldom immediate. Most souls passed through purgatory, a realm of purification where sins were cleansed through suffering. Those who rejected God or died in mortal sin were believed to be condemned to hell, a place of eternal torment and separation from divine grace. These teachings were reinforced by vivid sermons, dramatic paintings inside churches, and tales repeated across generations. Villagers did not merely believe in these realms intellectually, they felt their presence emotionally. Fear of hell motivated confession, repentance, and adherence to moral rules. Hope for heaven encouraged charity, prayer, and piety. Concern for purgatory drove families to request masses for deceased relatives and to give alms on their behalf. The Church's authority over the fate of the soul gave it unparalleled influence over the behavior of the living. The rituals surrounding death were among the most important in village life. When a villager approached death, the priest was summoned immediately. He administered extreme unction, anointing the dying person with holy oil, praying for their soul, and urging them to confess their sins. This ritual provided immense comfort to families who believed it protected the dying person from spiritual danger. The presence of the priest at the deathbed was so central that villagers feared dying suddenly, without confession or blessing. After death, the body was washed and prepared for burial, often by family or neighbors under the guidance of local custom. The church required burial in consecrated ground, usually the churchyard. This requirement reinforced the idea that the deceased remained part of the Christian community, even in death. Burial outside holy ground was unthinkable, reserved for criminals, excommunicated individuals, or those who died in dishonor. Funerals were solemn affairs that brought the entire village together. The church bell tolled slowly, announcing death to the community. Villagers gathered for Mass, hearing prayers for the soul of the departed. The priest led the procession to the churchyard, where the body was laid to rest facing east, symbolizing readiness for resurrection at the end of time. These rituals provided spiritual reassurance and reinforced the church's role as guardian of the soul's journey. The church also shaped how villagers mourned. Excessive displays of grief were discouraged, seen as questioning God's will. Instead, mourning was expressed through prayer, masses for the dead, and acts of charity. Villagers believed that giving alms in memory of the deceased could shorten their time in purgatory. The dead were not forgotten. They remained part of the spiritual community, influencing the actions of the living through remembrance and obligation. Tombs and grave markers in the churchyard reinforced the church's teachings about mortality and salvation. Cross-shaped markers reminded villagers of Christ's sacrifice. Carved images depicted skeletons, hourglasses, and other symbols of the fleeting nature of life. Inscriptions urged the living to reflect on their own mortality. To walk through the churchyard each day, something villagers did constantly, was to walk among reminders of life's impermanence and the urgency of spiritual preparation. The church's control over death extended to inheritance. Wills were recorded and witnessed in the presence of clergy. The church often received bequests of land, money, or goods in exchange for offering prayers for the deceased. These bequests enriched ecclesiastical institutions while reinforcing the belief that the church played a crucial role in securing salvation. Even poor villagers sometimes left gifts to the church, hoping to secure spiritual benefit for themselves or their families. Commemoration ceremonies kept deceased villagers present in community life. On All Souls' Day, the priest led prayers for the dead. Families lit candles in church, believing the light guided souls through purgatory. Some villagers left food offerings in the churchyard, a tradition with roots in pre-Christian customs, but reinterpreted by the church as symbolic nourishment for the souls of the departed. Through these rituals, the dead remained spiritually connected to the living, reinforcing community bonds across generations. Fear of restless spirits also shaped behavior. Villagers believed that souls trapped in purgatory or denied proper burial might wander the earth. The church taught that such spirits appeared not to haunt, but to request prayers. Sightings of ghosts were interpreted as spiritual pleas rather than supernatural threats. This interpretation strengthened the church's role as intermediary between the living and the dead. Priests offered special masses or prayers to appease restless souls, further emphasizing ecclesiastical authority over spiritual disturbances. Death also played a role in community memory. The church recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials in parish registers, preserving a written history of the village. These records served practical purposes, tracking kinship, confirming inheritance rights, but also reinforced the church's role as custodian of communal identity. The village's past, present, and future passed through the priest's hands. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the church's influence over death was its promise of salvation. In a world filled with hardship, the hope of heaven offered profound comfort. Medieval villagers believed that lives marked by suffering, poverty, and toil were not wasted. They were tests of faith. Those who endured with humility and devotion would be rewarded in the next life. This belief transformed daily struggle into spiritual purpose. It gave meaning to loss, illness, and injustice. It encouraged patience, forgiveness, and perseverance. The Church taught that salvation required obedience, attendance at Mass, confession, penance, good works, avoidance of sin. By tying salvation to participation in church life, the institution strengthened its hold on the community. Villagers who feared for their souls adhered closely to the rituals and teachings prescribed by the clergy. This spiritual obedience translated into social stability. In the medieval village, the church stood not only as a guide for living, but as the gateway through which every soul passed at death. Its teachings shaped how villagers prepared for death, how they mourned, how they remembered, and how they hoped. The Church controlled the narrative of death just as completely as it controlled the narrative of life. To understand the full scope of the Church's influence, one must also consider its political power, its ability to shape leadership, enforce loyalty, and interact with secular authority in ways that directly impacted medieval English villagers. The Church was not merely a religious institution, it was a political force woven into every level of society. From kings and bishops down to local priests and village reeves, the Church participated actively in governance, legislation, diplomacy, and social order. Its reach extended far beyond the pulpit. In medieval Europe, church and state were not separate spheres but interdependent powers. The monarchy relied on the church for legitimacy. Kings were crowned by bishops, who proclaimed that the monarch ruled by divine authority. This ritual framed the king not as a mere earthly ruler, but as God's appointed shepherd over the realm. Villagers absorbed this idea through sermons and tradition. Obedience to the king became a religious obligation, not just a civic one. At the local level, the church shaped politics through its moral authority. Priests advised village reeves and sometimes influenced manorial decisions. Their counsel carried weight because it was believed to reflect divine will. When disputes arose between villagers or between tenants and the Lord's officials, the priest's opinion often tilted outcomes. Secular leaders recognized that cooperation with the church promoted stability. A lord who defied the church risked social unrest, spiritual condemnation, and loss of reputation. The church's political power was also tied to its immense wealth. Land ownership made the church one of the largest landholders in England. Monasteries operated as economic engines, producing wool, grain, fish, and other goods for sale or trade. Wealth allowed the church to build alliances, influence negotiations, and fund infrastructure. Some monasteries maintained roads, bridges, and mills that served local communities. These services strengthened political ties between the church and villages. At times, the church enforced its political power through excommunication or interdict. Excommunication cut an individual off from the sacraments. Interdict, a more dramatic action, suspended all religious services within a region. No masses, no baptisms, no weddings, no funerals. To medieval villagers, interdict was terrifying. It meant spiritual abandonment on a massive scale. The church used these tools primarily against rulers, not common people. But villagers suffered the consequences. When a king angered the papacy, An entire kingdom could be placed under interdict, plunging villages into spiritual crisis. Because villagers feared spiritual consequences, they often pressured their secular lords to resolve conflicts with the church. This bottom-up pressure gave the church leverage in negotiations that might otherwise have been dominated by military power or political strategy. The church understood that its influence relied on the devotion of ordinary people, and it used that devotion strategically. Local parish priests, though not wealthy or politically elite, played a role in shaping political consciousness. They delivered royal announcements during Mass. They reminded parishioners of obligations to the crown. They mediated disputes involving taxes, labor obligations, and land boundaries. Priests were literate when most villagers were not, giving them the ability to interpret legal documents, contracts, and messages. This literacy made them indispensable to local administration. The church also shaped political identity through rituals and ceremonies. Feast days celebrated not only saints, but political unity. Prayers for the king were integrated into the liturgy. Victories in war, deliverance from famine, or the birth of royal heirs were commemorated with special services. These events tied villagers emotionally to the realm and reinforced the idea that national identity was inseparable from Christian identity. Education further strengthened the church's political role. Boys who displayed intelligence and discipline might be sent to monasteries or cathedral schools where they learned Latin, theology, and administration. Some became priests. Others became clerks, scribes, or advisors to nobles. Through education, the church created a class of literate individuals who served in government and maintained close ties to ecclesiastical authority. This blurred the line between religious and political elites. Monasteries served as centers of diplomacy. Kings and nobles sought counsel from abbots, who often acted as intermediaries in disputes. Some monasteries stored important documents, tax records, and charters. Others offered sanctuary to political refugees, shielding them from secular arrest within the sacred space of the monastery. This practice reinforced the Church's independence from secular law and demonstrated its ability to shape political outcomes. The Church's political influence also had international dimensions. England was part of a wider Christian world governed spiritually by the papacy in Rome. Papal decrees affected local villages. Changes in church law, such as rules about marriage, tithes, or clerical behavior, filtered down from Rome through bishops to priests, and finally to villagers. This vertical chain connected the smallest hamlet to global religious politics. While villagers may not have been fully aware of these dynamics, they lived within a system shaped by distant decisions. Even taxation reflected this dual authority. Villagers paid tithes to the church and rents or taxes to secular lords. The church could also levy special taxes, such as Peter's pence, a payment collected throughout England for the papacy. When financial burdens weighed heavily on villagers, distinctions between secular and ecclesiastical taxes blurred. The church taught that paying tithes ensured divine favor, while failure to pay risked spiritual consequences. This belief softened resistance to ecclesiastical taxation and reinforced obedience. The church also influenced warfare. Priests blessed armies before battle. They preached crusades, urging men to take up arms in foreign wars framed as holy missions. Even local conflicts were justified through religious rhetoric. A lord could frame a feud as a defense of Christian rights. A village militia might march under the banner of a saint. Through its blessing or condemnation, the church legitimized warfare and shaped how villagers understood violence. In times of rebellion or social unrest, the church often acted as mediator. During peasant uprisings or disputes between nobles and the crown, clergy attempted to negotiate peace. They urged obedience, but also called for justice. While not always successful, their involvement reflected the Church's belief that stability was a divine mandate. All of these dimensions, land ownership, legal authority, education, taxation, diplomacy, and spiritual influence, combined to make the Church a political force unlike any other. It did not rely on armies or coercion alone. Its authority flowed from belief, tradition, and sacred obligation. Villagers obeyed the Church because they believed their souls depended on it. Lords cooperated with the Church because they needed its legitimacy. Kings negotiated with the Church because its influence reached deep into the hearts of their subjects. In a medieval English village, politics was not a separate sphere of life. It was interwoven with religious observance, moral teaching, social relationships, and economic structures. The Church stood at the center of this web, shaping not only personal faith, but the governance of the realm. As pervasive as the Church's influence was in medieval English villages, it also played a significant role in shaping patterns of community cooperation, charity, and social cohesion. The Church was not simply an institution that issued commands or imposed obligations. It also served as the central hub of communal life, a place where villagers gathered, shared resources, resolved conflicts, and collectively navigated the uncertainties of existence. Understanding this dimension reveals why the Church's authority endured for centuries. It offered not only structure and discipline, but also belonging, comfort, and an enduring sense of unity. The church building itself was the heart of the village. It was often the oldest, most solid structure, made of stone, while most homes were built of timber and thatch. It stood on the highest ground or in the center of the settlement, visible from every direction. Its bells marked time, summoned villagers to worship, and signaled emergencies. Its churchyard served as a burial ground, a meeting place, and sometimes even a venue for markets or assemblies. To enter the church was to step into a space that connected the living, the dead, and the divine. The church fostered cooperation through rituals that involved the entire community. One such ritual was the rogation procession, in which villagers walked the boundaries of their fields with the priest, praying for a successful growing season. These events strengthened community identity and reminded villagers that their prosperity depended on shared effort and collective luck. The prayers, chants, and blessings reinforced spiritual unity, while the act of walking together created social connection. Another important communal activity was the maintenance of the church building itself. Villagers were responsible for repairing roofs, mending walls, caring for the churchyard, and providing candles or other supplies. These tasks were not viewed as burdens, but as acts of devotion. Contributing labor to the church reinforced a sense of ownership and participation in the sacred. Even the poorest villager found dignity in helping maintain the structure that symbolized God's presence. Festivals provided opportunities for joy and community bonding. The feast of the village's patron saint was a major event. Villagers gathered for Mass, followed by outdoor celebrations, games, feasting, dancing, and singing. These festivals were not frivolous. They reinforced the collective identity centered on the saint's protection. They reminded villagers that while their daily lives were marked by hardship, they were also part of a larger spiritual drama filled with hope and joy. The church also served as the main provider of charity. In a world without state welfare, charity was essential for survival. The church encouraged almsgiving, teaching that generosity toward the poor accumulated spiritual merit. Wealthier villagers donated food, clothing, or money, while others gave what little they could. Priests distributed these alms to those in need, widows, orphans, the ill, or the elderly. During harsh winters or famine years, monastic houses supplied bread or soup, sometimes saving entire communities from starvation. Charity was not simply material, it also had a moral dimension. The Church framed charity as a necessary expression of Christian virtue. It taught that failing to help the poor was a sin of omission. This moral framing strengthened communal bonds, making villagers responsible for one another. The poor were not marginalized, they were integrated into the spiritual life of the community, seen as recipients of divine favor through the charity they inspired. The Church played a central role in resolving conflict. When disputes arose over land, animals, debts, insults, the priest often intervened before matters escalated. His goal was not merely to settle the issue, but to restore harmony. He emphasized forgiveness, reminded villagers of their shared obligations, and warned against harboring resentment. Reconciliation was framed as a spiritual duty. This mediation prevented feuds from tearing the village apart and preserved the fragile unity necessary for survival. Communal prayer also reinforced solidarity. When disaster threatened, whether plague, drought, or storms, the priest gathered villagers for special services. They prayed collectively for protection or relief. These gatherings reassured villagers that they were not facing hardship alone. Collective prayer offered emotional support and strengthened the belief that divine aid was possible. Even if the crisis persisted, the sense of shared suffering, shaped by religious ritual, brought comfort. In times of personal grief, loss of a spouse, child, or parent, the Church provided structure, ritual, and communal support. Funerals involved the entire village, and prayers for the dead reinforced the idea that every individual remained connected to the community, even in death. Families relied on neighbors for emotional and material support, knowing that life in a medieval village demanded solidarity. The Church framed grief within a narrative of salvation, transforming tragedy into a reminder of divine purpose. The Church's influence on hospitality also shaped community life. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor often relied on the charity of villagers, encouraged by the priest's teachings. Hospitality was seen as both a duty and an opportunity to serve Christ, who was believed to appear in the guise of the stranger. This belief helped foster generosity and maintain social cohesion across communities. Social gatherings that took place outside church walls were often shaped indirectly by church teaching. Weddings, for instance, were religious ceremonies, but also large communal celebrations. Villagers feasted, danced, and sang together. The Church sanctioned the joy of the occasion while emphasizing the moral responsibilities of marriage. Similarly, harvest celebrations, though rooted in agricultural tradition, were infused with prayers of thanksgiving and blessings for the upcoming season. Even storytelling reinforced community identity. Many tales told around the hearth at night were stories of saints, miracles, or moral lessons. These stories transmitted values across generations and strengthened the collective religious imagination. They reassured villagers that they were part of a larger spiritual narrative filled with meaning and divine oversight. But the Church's role in community life was not purely nurturing. Its presence also created mechanisms of social control that villagers internalized. Gossip about moral failings, fear of public penance, and anxiety about spiritual consequences influenced behavior. A villager who violated norms risked not only ecclesiastical punishment but also social isolation. The Church shaped expectations so deeply that communities often enforced discipline among themselves without clerical intervention. This dual role, supportive yet disciplinary, was central to the Church's effectiveness. It offered comfort during hardship, guidance during confusion, and structure during instability. At the same time, it established moral boundaries, reinforced obedience, and discouraged dissent. Villagers depended on the church emotionally, materially, and spiritually. This dependence made its influence not only pervasive, but enduring. The communal dimension of the church's authority reveals why it remained the most powerful institution in medieval village life. It was not just a source of rules or doctrines. It was a center of belonging, a refuge in crisis, a moral guide, and a unifying force. Through rituals, charity, conflict resolution, and shared worship, the church wove itself into every relationship, every tradition, and every moment of village life. To complete the picture of how deeply the church controlled daily life in medieval English villages, one must consider the emotional and psychological world that villagers inhabited. Beyond its visible institutions, rituals, and authority, the church shaped the inner experiences of fear, hope, guilt, comfort, identity, and meaning. These internal forces bound villagers to the church far more tightly than law, obligation, or habit ever could. The church provided not only rules, but a world view, a lens through which every joy, sorrow, and uncertainty was interpreted. At the core of this worldview was a profound sense of cosmic order. Villagers believed that everything in existence, from the growth of crops to the rise of kings, was part of a divine design. The church articulated this design, offering explanations for events that would otherwise seem random or cruel. When illness struck, villagers believed it was a test of faith or punishment for sin. When a harvest was abundant, it was a sign of God's favor. When tragedy occurred, they found solace in the idea that suffering had spiritual purpose. This worldview provided a sense of stability in a world filled with unpredictability. Medieval life was harsh. A minor injury could become fatal. Storms could destroy crops. Wolves could kill livestock. Hunger was common. Without modern science or government support systems, villagers turned to the church for reassurance. It gave them a sense of control, not over the events themselves, but over their interpretation. If they followed the church's teachings, confessed their sins, prayed, and performed acts of charity, they believed they could influence their fate and secure divine protection. Guilt played a powerful role in this psychological landscape. The church taught that sin jeopardized the soul. Even small failings, impatience, anger, dishonesty, required repentance. Villagers internalized these teachings, examining their actions constantly. They felt guilt not only for actions that harmed others, but for internal emotions or desires that the church labeled sinful. This inner scrutiny created a strong incentive to seek confession and penance, reinforcing the church's role as spiritual guide. Fear of hell was equally powerful. Descriptions of eternal torment were vivid in sermons and church art. Villagers believed that one unconfessed mortal sin could condemn a soul forever. This fear encouraged obedience, humility, and regular participation in church life. It discouraged rebellion or dissent. The church did not need an army to maintain authority. Fear of eternal punishment was often enough. Yet fear was balanced by hope. The church offered a path to redemption through sacraments, good deeds, and the intercession of saints. Villagers believed that no matter how difficult life became, heaven awaited the faithful. This hope softened the harshness of daily hardship. It gave meaning to suffering and elevated mundane tasks, plowing fields, raising children, enduring illness, into acts of devotion. Hope in salvation was a powerful emotional anchor that kept villagers committed to the church. The church also shaped villagers' understanding of themselves as moral beings. Identity was not rooted in individualism, but in belonging to a Christian community. A villager was first and foremost a child of God, a member of Christendom, part of a spiritual family with shared values and beliefs. This collective identity offered emotional security. It reassured villagers that they were not alone in facing the difficulties of life or the uncertainties of death. Their community, guided by the church, was a source of comfort and strength. Self-worth was often tied to religious behavior. A good Christian was one who attended Mass, confessed sins, avoided forbidden practices, gave to the poor, and performed duties faithfully. Those who adhered to these expectations earned respect within the community and believed themselves closer to salvation. Failure brought guilt, shame, and fear of divine punishment. The Church thus shaped not only villagers' behavior, but their sense of personal value. Another powerful emotional force was the presence of the supernatural in everyday life. Villagers believed that angels, demons, saints, and spirits moved through the world constantly. The Church taught that angels protected the faithful and demons tempted the weak. Saints could intervene during moments of crisis. The dead could request prayers through dreams or strange occurrences. These beliefs created a vivid inner world where spiritual beings felt as real as neighbors. The Church did not discourage this worldview. It defined its boundaries and directed its meaning. Prayer was a central emotional practice. Villagers prayed for health, good harvests, safe childbirth, forgiveness, and protection. Prayer offered comfort during fear, grief, or uncertainty. It provided a sense of communication with the divine. Even those who could not read learned prayers by memory. Our Father, Hail Mary, the Creed. These words became emotional rituals that offered peace during distress. The Church taught that God listened, and villagers believed it deeply. Moments of collective worship amplified these emotions. When villagers gathered for Mass, they participated in a shared experience that transcended daily hardship. The rituals, the lighting of candles, the chanting of hymns, the smell of incense, the rhythm of prayer, created a sense of sacred time and space. This collective devotion reinforced emotional bonds within the community and deepened spiritual commitment. The church building, with its stone walls, carved altars, and painted saints, was a refuge where villagers experienced awe, comfort, and belonging. The church also shaped the emotional landscape surrounding major life transitions: birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. Baptism brought joy and relief. Confession during adolescence offered moral direction. Marriage ceremonies blended solemn vows with communal celebration. Funerals, though sorrowful, provided spiritual reassurance. These rites framed life not as a series of isolated events, but as a sacred journey guided by divine purpose. Emotional dependence on the Church created strong resistance to anything that threatened religious unity. Heresy, dissent, or disobedience were viewed not only as intellectual errors, but as emotional and spiritual dangers. Villagers feared that deviation from church teaching could bring divine punishment upon the entire community. This fear encouraged conformity, but also inspired genuine care for others' spiritual well-being. It reinforced the idea that salvation was a collective responsibility. In the medieval mind, the Church provided the architecture of meaning itself. It gave answers to the deepest questions: why do we suffer? What is good? What happens after death? How should we live? These answers shaped emotions more profoundly than any external rule. Villagers turned to the Church not because they were coerced, but because it offered coherence in a world filled with uncertainty. This emotional and psychological dependence completed the Church's authority. It was not merely the institution that governed externals, law, labor, ritual. It governed the inner life. It shaped how villagers felt, feared, hoped, remembered, and loved. Its teachings intertwined with every joy and sorrow, forming a spiritual fabric that held communities together. Through these emotional forces, fear, hope, guilt, comfort, identity, the Church exerted its most enduring influence. It was not simply the center of village life. In many ways, it was the village's heart, shaping not only how people lived, but how they understood life itself. As we close the story of medieval village life, we see clearly that the Church was not simply part of the community. It was the context in which the community lived. It was the narrative that explained the world. It was the structure that governed life. It was the hope that softened death. It was, in every sense, the heart of the medieval village, shaping not only how people lived, but how they understood what it meant to be human.